Hello, and happy Astora to you all. If you don't know me, my name is Patrick Finney. I'm a longtime member of Oak Spirit Sanctuary, a member of the governing board, and a second-year candidate for ordination. Thank you for joining us in this workshop. This is a pre-recorded event, but I will be watching it live during its premiere, and we'll check in periodically over the next few days to the comment section. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please, I would love to engage. The topic, Coming to Terms with Christianity, concerning first steps, history, and culture, is one that I have thought about quite a bit, in which I come at from the perspective of someone with a background in comparative religious studies, who practices across religious boundaries. While I certainly will be sharing some information that I hope you find educational and interesting, the way I see the goal of this workshop isn't so much as an educational endeavor as it is a reflective one. While I'll touch on the historical relationship between Christianity and ancient and pre-Christian religions and modern paganism, it is not a workshop about the pagan origins of Christian practice or Christian oppression of pagan ideas. The historical facts I'll be sharing with you are in service of a different goal. And while, as many of you know, I have a deep respect, reverence, and even love for certain strains of Christianity, I'm certainly not looking to proselytize in this workshop, nor would I ever. This is not a workshop about Christo-paganism or anything like that either. I'll do my best to keep in mind that the audience to whom I'm speaking is a pagan audience, and that I'm offering these suggestions for reflection to the benefit of those of you who have or continue to have a tense, conflicted, or even contentious, painful, or abusive relationship with Christians, Christian institution, or the idea of Christianity. I respect that. Your experiences are real and valid. For many of you, the scars you carry from rejection and judgment at the hands of a certain kind of Christian worldview, or individual Christians, some of whom are your closest friends and family, are deep, and certainly won't be healed as the result of a 25-minute online workshop. My only hope with this workshop is that it perhaps opens the possibility for us to begin to think about how we might move forward from what is too often a situation in which we as pagan individuals and as a pagan community hunker down in a defensive posture, protecting our tender wounds, sometimes by lashing out, and or feel continuously victimized. Instead, perhaps we can begin to ask ourselves how we might be able to come to terms with what is the dominant spiritual tradition in our culture. It is my sincere hope that as paganism and nature spirituality grows and evolves, as it has for the last 30 years that I've been involved in it, and as it comes more and more into the public consciousness, more and more Christians will, as some already have, come to recognize our path as valid and not altogether out of harmony with our own, with their own. Likewise, I hope the same for pagans in terms of their attitude toward Christianity. Not because I want people to think well of Christianity or of Christ, but because I want my pagan siblings to be able to let go of some of their pain and anger, to feel less victimized and oppressed, finding some kind of way to feel even a little less oppressed is simply healthier for us. Coming to terms with Christianity in a conscious, reflective way, I sincerely believe is an important step in a certain way to disengaging from Christianity, of letting it go if that's our choice, and to fully emerge into our own independent pagan selves in pagan communities, rather than being defined by that which we oppose, or that which we reject, or that which we define ourselves as being oppressed by. Coming to terms with Christianity can be tackled in a variety of ways. I'd suggest that perhaps the best way to begin this project is to first look at the macro level of history and culture, and only later to tackle the harder, deeper, more personal level of our individual relationship with Christians or with particular Christian churches or church experiences. So, because this is our Ostara celebration, let's begin by just talking quickly about our Ostara vis-a-vis Easter. Obviously, the cultural celebrations surrounding Easter, the most sacred of all Christian holidays, is rife with pagan imagery, symbols, and practices. I don't need to go into a ton of detail about all of them. You know it, I know it. Most people know this. It's become surprisingly common knowledge that the very name of the holiday, Easter, is derived from the name of an Anglo-Saxon goddess associated with spring. Let's pause here momentarily and just note that this is only true in English-speaking cultures. In virtually all of the rest of Christianity, the name for the holiday is derived from the Greek word Pascha, which is the biblical Greek word for the Jewish Passover. Nonetheless, for us English speakers, Easter, we are told, derives from Ostare in Anglo-Saxon culture, or Ostara in Germanic culture. So how do we know this? Well, because in the 7th or 8th centuries, the super influential Christian scholar Bede, it's often called the Venerable Bede, speculated that this is the case. However, other than Bede's assertion, there's no archaeological, textual, or other kind of physical evidence of the worship of any such goddess. There is some scholarship, for sure, but it is not a settled matter at all. It's still a matter of some debate, and it's based on speculation dating back to the 19th century, and based on linguistic analysis, all of which traces back to this single reference by an eminent medieval scholar. Was he right? Was he wrong? We don't know. Nonetheless, the holiday, Easter, is called what it is in English. And it seems somehow, the word seems somehow related to probably either the East or to springtime. Now in German culture, we have the tradition of the spring hare, or as we know it now, the Easter bunny. And this has been associated with spring, and thus Easter, thus tied to Easter, for time immemorial, literally. No one remembers why. But, again, in the 19th century, during the great blossoming of folklore studies, someone speculated that the hare was probably sacred to Ostara, about whom there were some existent stories floating around in the oral tradition. But again, there's no solid evidence that this is the case in ancient times. or that the figure of Astara herself didn't derive from the spread of the idea of the English goddess Astarte after the 8th century. We simply don't know for sure. Now, my point here is not to debunk the story that we tell ourselves about the pagan origins of many of the traditions of the Easter season. Far from it. We know precious little about the historical Jesus, his teachings, or how early Christians actually worshipped, or what they thought. My point is that there are all sorts of cultural myths that we tell ourselves about why we do the things that we do, and what the origins of a sacred text, a ritual practice, or a cultural tradition are. Many, if not most, of what most of us know about the origins of our religions are only loosely historical, or are completely ahistorical. And by we, I mean all of us. Pagans, Christians, Buddhists, Muslims. The vast majority of what we think we know about ancient history is speculative at best. And many of our modern practices, regardless of the religions that we practice, are not nearly as ancient as we tell ourselves. And that, to my mind, is okay. Right? In order to be culturally bound together, we tell ourselves meaningful stories. And whether or not they are 100% true in the historical sense may not be as important as one might think. The fact is that the practices, which some religious scholars call vernacular spiritual practices, things like folk traditions, customs, symbology, and especially the rituals of home, hearth, and community, transcend or maybe provide the undercurrent for what we think of as separate religions. In other words, to a certain extent, these practices are more durable than the religions and are independent of the religions that exist on top of them. So it seems to me that rather than thinking about how the Christians co-opted or stole pagan ideas and practices like eggs in the springtime or evergreens in the winter, perhaps we can think of it like this: that these practices are practices that we share, that have endured among the people, the folk, us folk, regardless of whatever religion we folk might or might not practice, now or in the past. That instead of regarding these traditions as an opportunity to craft a narrative of theft and conflict between pagans and Christians, that from our 21st century pluralistic perspective, we can see it as an opportunity to tell ourselves a story of sharing a meaningful tradition that transcends our differences. But, you may ask, what of the real historic persecutions of pagans by Christians? From the time of Constantine through the Middle Ages and the so-called Burning Times, from the Crusades, the Age of Exploration, through the era of European colonialism, hasn't Christianity perpetuated horrific atrocities against pre-Christian and non-Christian peoples left and right? And the answer to this question is yes, absolutely. Christian people and Christian institutions have done terrible, awful things. And they've used the religion as justification. And these things continue to happen right up to today. But this is what is important to remember. If one wants to sincerely and fairly engage across cultural or religious boundaries, it is vital that one compares like to like. What is unfair and disingenuous is when one compares the best of one culture to the worst of the other. If you as a pagan feel that your people and your culture have continuously faced persecution and oppression at the hands of Christians, I invite you to at least consider this. Christians themselves were victims of Roman imperial persecution in multiple waves for centuries prior to the reign of Constantine, which began in 312. In other words, Christians endured horrific and widespread persecution at the hands of pagans because of the religion that they practiced. The history of the early church is chock full of Christian martyrs who died at the hands of pagans. Now, even after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as the official religion under Theodosius I in the late 4th century, Christians of multiple sorts, primarily Arians and non-Chalcedonian Christians, were persecuted and martyred at the hands of not pagan polytheists this time, but of Christians who followed the official state version of the religion. So here's the point. The religion, be it polytheistic paganism or monotheistic Christianity, was not the common denominator to the religious persecution found in the Hellenistic period. It was imperialism and the imperialistic dream of cultural hegemony. In fact, in certain places, such as Alexandria, and in certain forms of Christianity, it could be argued that there was little difference in practice between those who participated in mystery cults dedicated to Persephone, Isis, Mithra, and what we now think of as esoteric Gnostic Christianity. Now, this form of Christianity, from a mainline Orthodox Christian perspective, from the institutional perspective, is a heretical form of the religion, but which I would argue is every bit as truly and authentically Christian as the form which became the official state religion. Perhaps more so. While, as the Roman Empire collapsed and splintered, the Roman Catholic Church retained much of the form and imperialistic ambitions of the Roman Empire, and as such strove for its own hegemony, there were in fact always and continue to be many Christianities, plural, and that they were every bit as oppressed as the non-Christian religions that came into contact with either imperialism or colonialism as the centuries progressed. Free Spirit Christians, Catholic Christians, Quakers, Shakers, they all faced persecution. And these were and are Christians, whom I dare say that many of you, if you learned a bit about them, would find are not so far from us as you might assume. Likewise, it may be good to remember that gender-balanced, polytheistic empires, like the Aztecs, promoted human sacrifice. and Celtic pagans kidnapped children and made them live as guard animals, cold and hungry among the livestock, as St. Patrick was forced to do as a child. I share these examples only to suggest that as we catalog the atrocities of history, that we do not attribute all of the blame to one religion or the other, or even to religion as the sole or even main cause, but to at least entertain the possibility that the root causes have more to do with tribalism, power, and the will to dominate the other, whatever that other may be. It is absolutely true that the current modern version of cultural domination in America tends to wrap itself in the robe of Christianity. This I don't deny. However, we also have to consider that so do some of the most powerful expressions of justice, liberation, and self-sacrifice in the service of others find their inspiration and expression within the Christian milieu. When we think of Christian, do we only think of Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and the loathsome Westboro Baptist Church? Or do we also stop to consider people like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, the Christian warrior and freedom fighter John Brown, the environmental mystic, visionary, and scientist Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, or the leaders and the rank-and-file Christians of the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, or the current continuing struggle for racial justice in America, people like Cornel West. To disregard them and their Christianity does a disservice not only to Christianity, but denies an essential part of who these noble people are as individuals. As a total aside, I only very recently happened upon the fact that Reverend Dr. King, while in graduate school, wrote not one, but 2 papers on the pagan influence on early Christianity. Just a fun fact. So to change tacks, when we in the 21st century, think of Native Americans, for example, we tend to frame these diverse peoples as primarily victims of oppression, when in fact many of the tribes were themselves oppressors. There's clear evidence of bloody brutality, rape, human trafficking, and slavery among and between indigenous cultures prior to colonization. The Pueblo-dwelling tribes do not live where they live and how they live for any reason other than their own safety, after being dislocated from previous homelands by more aggressive warrior tribes. Even after the arrival of Europeans, some tribes, in fact, held African slaves. A people, a culture, a religion, whether indigenous, European, Christian, pagan, Celtic, Norse, Germanic, whatever, can throughout its history oscillate between being a victim and an oppressor, an enforcer of oppressive systems or a reformer or a revolutionary. To see any as merely one thing or another is naive and unfair. Contemporary paganism has its own share of issues, with abuse of spiritual authority, sexual predation, judgment, hypocrisy, and all of the things that we rightly condemn in Christianity. or in politics, or in business. I guess I'm just encouraging us to ask ourselves, why do we, 21st century pagans, have such negative feelings about, for example, the use of certain perhaps pre-Christian traditions or nature-based symbols being used by Christians in their religious celebrations? What emotions exactly are we feeling anyway? And are these emotions based in reality, lived or historical, or are they based on a myth, a shallow understanding of history, or of a story that we're telling ourselves? And why are we telling these stories? I certainly have thoughts about these questions, but my opinions are not what's important here. What I think is important is that we ask ourselves individually where we are vis-a-vis the dominant religion in America, and likely the religion of our families of origin. And maybe more importantly, why? There may be multiple answers to these questions. And I need to emphasize here that I'm not trying to say don't feel defensive or don't have negative feelings about Christianity or anything like that. It's not necessarily a bad thing either that we have pseudo-historical myths around which we construct our sense of community. These stories can be infused with deep meaning and can serve a constructive purpose. I also understand the need to sometimes just vent our feelings while we are in the safety of our in-group spaces. The feelings that we have are real, and we should have the opportunity to express them openly and honestly. And I'm not judging people for having feelings. The gist of my point, however, is that if you have negative feelings about Christianity, which may be very understandable given your personal experience, that you may find it valuable, perhaps even a growth opportunity, to name those feelings. Are you angry? Do you feel judged? Are there lingering feelings of shame? Do you feel undervalued or unseen for some reason? And what is the source or trigger for those feelings? To consciously think about exactly what feelings we're having regarding Christianity can be a good step to waking up to the exact nature of the wounds that we may be carrying, and whether or not those wounds have some other source, and that we're merely projecting them unfairly onto the religion. They may have an origin not in the religion, but in actions of an individual, wrapped in the cloak of the religion. Many of us have had difficult, strained, sometimes even traumatic experiences in the Christian world. I myself had more than one very upsetting, potentially scarring experience in the Catholic Church. I was blessed, however, to also have some very, very nurturing experiences that balanced my view of the Church and helped me to realize that not every priest, nun, or catechism teacher reflected all there is within the faith. I then went on to study deeply the history of Christianity and its huge diversity of expressions, along with studying other religions. And this helped to lead me to what, for me, is a comfortable relationship with the Christian path. In the end, for me, Christianity simply is what it is, just as paganism is what it is. It's a messy collection of widely diverse paths with a complicated and winding history, some of which is sublimely beautiful, and some of which is unfathomably horrific. Both have been abused by individuals and institutions in the same way. The evils of Christianity seem so much larger because at this point in history, Christianity is simply so much larger. And the balance of evil to good seems so much more weighted to evil, in part because, one, Christianity itself is co-opted by secular political power whores, and two, just like with compliments and criticism, we tend to hear and remember the negative experiences in life. So, I know probably few pagans have had the same experiences that I've had vis-a-vis Christianity, and that for many of you, coming to a place of comfort with Christianity will be a much more daunting path. It did take me a long time and work, but this is especially true for those of you who have continue to have difficult relations with individual Christians among your friends or coworkers or in your family. And advice on navigating these experiences and their attendant emotions is a whole other subject, perhaps better suited for an in-person discussion rather than an online workshop. I know that it's a subject that has come up in more than one pastoral conversation that I've had with folks. Perhaps in the future, it can be the subject of an in-person sharing circle type of a workshop. And of course, Tiffany, Andes, and I are both at your service if it's a topic that you would like to discuss privately. What I am offering you today is simply encouragement to think about Christianity, to give you some food for thought, and perhaps a jumping off point, to begin to look at what for many of us is a powerful shadow in our spiritual lives, one that I believe is healthy to face openly, consciously, and objectively. And in doing so, it may be one of the early steps that one can take toward healing and integration and toward an ever more mature spiritual life. So, with that, I thank you for your attention, and again, happy Ostara, and blessed be.